Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up, because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The stories. This hiker realized the figure on the ridge was watching. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park gets over 12 million visitors a year. Most of those people never leave the paved roads. They pull their cars over at the scenic overlooks, take a few pictures of the blue mist hanging over the valleys, and drive back to their hotels. But if you step off the asphalt and hike just 5 miles deep into the backcountry, the crowds disappear completely. If you go 15 miles deep off the maintained trails and into the old-growth hardwood forests near the North Carolina border, you enter a totally different world. The canopy is so thick that the ground stays damp year-round. There is no cell service, there are no rangers, it is just hundreds of thousands of acres of steep, unbroken wilderness. In late September of 2022, a 28-year-old amateur wildlife photographer named Mark Davies decided to spend a week in this exact area. Mark was tough. He was an experienced off-trail navigator who preferred to bushwhack his own routes rather than follow the crowded tourist paths. His goal for this trip was to photograph a specific, rarely seen black bear den located on a high-elevation ridge known as Thunderhead Mountain. He packed a week's worth of food, a heavy-duty canvas tent, and 15 pounds of camera gear, including a massive 600mm telephoto lens. He parked his Jeep at a remote logging gate on a Monday morning and walked into the trees. He planned to be totally alone. The first 2 days of the hike were grueling but uneventful. Mark pushed his way through dense thickets of mountain laurel and scrambled up steep, muddy ravines. By Wednesday afternoon, he had reached a high, exposed saddle between two peaks. It was a perfect vantage point. He set up his camp just below the tree line to block the wind, and then he climbed back up to the exposed rock to glass the surrounding mountains. He set his camera up on a heavy carbon fiber tripod and attached the 600mm lens. He started scanning the ridgeline directly across the valley from him. That ridge was about 2 miles away, separated from his position by a sheer drop and a river gorge. As he swept the lens slowly from left to right, looking for movement in the brush, he stopped. Something didn't fit the natural geometry of the rocks and the pine trees. It was a shape. It was standing perfectly still on the very edge of the opposite cliff. Mark dialed in the focus ring on his lens. The blurry shape sharpened into the clear silhouette of a person. It was a man, standing right on the precipice, looking out over the valley. Mark didn't panic. Finding another hiker in the backcountry is rare, but it isn't impossible. He assumed it was just another extreme backpacker enjoying the view. The man was too far away to make out any facial features, even with the massive lens. He was wearing dark, earth-toned clothing that blended in perfectly with the shadows of the rocks. Mark took his eye off the viewfinder, waved his arms above his head, and yelled out a greeting. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and faded into nothing. The distance was too great. The wind was too loud. Mark looked back through the camera. The figure hadn't moved. He hadn't waved back. He was just standing there, absolutely motionless, facing Mark's direction. Mark watched him for another 10 minutes. The guy didn't adjust his backpack. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood there like a statue. Eventually, the sun started to drop behind the mountains and the light faded. Mark packed up his tripod and headed back down to his tent. He felt a little uneasy, but he chalked it up to the isolation. When you are totally alone in the woods for days, your brain starts to play tricks on you. You start assigning malicious intent to completely normal things. The next morning, Mark woke up early. He wanted to push higher up the mountain to find the bear den. He broke camp, packed his gear, and started climbing. He hiked hard for 4 hours, navigating a brutal stretch of deadfall timber. Around noon, he broke through the trees onto another exposed rock outcropping. This one was significantly higher than his camp the night before. He sat down, drank some water, and pulled his binoculars out of his chest harness just to check the landscape. He scanned the new ridgeline across the valley. His stomach completely dropped. The figure was there. It was the same guy in the same dark clothing, but he wasn't on the ridge from yesterday. He had moved. And he had moved in the exact same direction and at the exact same elevation as Mark. Whoever this was, he was mirroring Mark's route, just staying one mountain over. Mark put the binoculars down. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. To get from that first ridge to this new one, the guy would have had to hike down into the gorge, cross the river in the dark, and climb straight up a rock face. It was an incredibly dangerous route. No casual hiker would do that just to match the pace of someone miles away. Mark immediately unclipped his camera from his bag and mounted the big telephoto lens. He needed to see exactly what this guy was doing. He laid down flat on the rock to lower his profile, rested the lens on his backpack to keep it steady, and found the figure in the viewfinder. He zoomed in all the way. The optical glass pulled the image in tight, cutting through the 2 miles of empty air. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. The guy wasn't wearing a backpack. He had no camping gear. He was wearing a tactical chest rig over a dark green hunting jacket. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was what the man was holding. He had his arms raised to his face. He was holding a high-powered spotting scope, and it was pointed directly at Mark. The guy wasn't looking at the scenery. He was looking straight down the barrel of Mark's camera lens. They were staring directly at each other across the void. Mark froze. Every survival instinct in his body was screaming at him to run. But he knew that if he ran blindly into the woods, he would be giving up his vantage point. He forced his hands to stop shaking. He pushed the shutter button on his camera, snapping 3 rapid-fire photos of the man. The mechanical click of the shutter sounded deafening in the quiet air. As soon as the photos were taken, the figure on the ridge lowered the spotting scope. He didn't wave, he didn't turn around. He simply took 1 step backward, slipping into the dark tree line behind him, and vanished. Mark was completely exposed on the rock. He realized with sickening clarity that he wasn't dealing with a curious hiker. He was dealing with a scout. Deep in the Appalachian backcountry, there are massive multi-million-dollar illegal operations. Some are growing narcotics. Some are poaching wild ginseng, which can sell for thousands of dollars a pound on the black market. These syndicates don't put up no trespassing signs. They use armed scouts to monitor the high ground. If a hiker wanders too close to a crop, the scouts don't call the police. They handle it themselves. Mark knew he had to get off the mountain. His original plan was to hike a loop that would take 3 more days. That plan was dead. He needed to take the most direct route straight down the fall line, back to the logging road where he parked his Jeep. He threw his camera into his pack, didn't bother to secure the straps, and bolted for the tree line. He was moving fast, careless, and loud, crashing through the underbrush. He didn't care about the noise anymore. He just needed to put distance between himself and that ridge. He hiked at a brutal pace for 6 hours, tearing his clothes on briars and twisting his ankles on hidden rocks. As the sun began to set, he reached the bottom of the valley. He was in a deep hollow, surrounded by massive hemlock trees. It was already pitch black under the canopy. He knew he couldn't navigate the river crossing in the dark. He had to stop and wait for morning. But he absolutely refused to set up his tent. A tent is a visual target. Instead, he found a massive uprooted oak tree and crawled into the dirt cavity beneath its roots. He pulled his sleeping bag over him, keeping his boots on and his bear spray in his hand. He didn't eat. He didn't turn on his headlamp. He just lay there in the dark, listening to the absolute silence of the forest. The darkness in the deep hollows of the Smoky Mountains is absolute. Once the sun dips behind the ridge, the thick canopy blocks out the moonlight, plunging the forest floor into a pitch-black void. Mark lay curled in a fetal position beneath the massive root system of the fallen oak tree. He was buried in damp earth and decaying leaves. The smell of rot and wet soil filled his nose. The temperature dropped into the low 40s, and his sweat-soaked base layers clung to his skin like ice. He didn't move. He barely breathed. Every sound in the forest was amplified by his surging adrenaline. A snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. The rustle of a squirrel sounded like a man walking. For the first 4 hours, he just listened to the natural, ambient noise of the woods. He started to convince himself that he had overreacted. He tried to rationalize that the man with the spotting scope was just a weirdo, maybe an extreme hunter scouting for bear season. But at 2 a.m., the natural sounds of the forest were cut short by something entirely artificial. It was a sharp, brief burst of static, a radio squawk. It came from the ridge he had just run down. Mark peered through the tangled web of oak roots. Across the hollow, high up on the slope he had descended hours ago, a light cut through the trees. It wasn't the bright white beam of a standard headlamp. It was a dull crimson red. Tactical red lights are used by the military and hunters to preserve night vision and avoid casting long, visible beams over great distances. The red light swept slowly across the forest floor in a methodical, sweeping pattern. Then, a second red light appeared about 50 yards to the left of the first one. They were moving in tandem. They were sweeping the valley in a grid. They knew exactly which drainage basin he had fled into, and they were actively hunting him. Mark's blood ran cold. He realized how incredibly lucky he was that he hadn't pitched his tent. A nylon tent, even a dark green one, would reflect that red light like a beacon. By burying himself in the dirt under a dead tree, he had effectively camouflaged his thermal and visual signature. The red lights moved closer. They were descending the steep slope with terrifying speed and coordination. These weren't lost hikers. They were moving through the treacherous, deadfall-choked terrain in the pitch black with practiced ease. One of the searchers reached the bottom of the hollow, passing within 20 feet of Mark's hiding spot. Mark could hear the heavy, rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel. He could hear the nylon of his jacket swishing with every step. The guy stopped. He shined the red light directly at the massive root system of the fallen oak. Mark closed his eyes tightly so the moisture in his eyes wouldn't reflect the light. He gripped his bear spray in his right hand, his thumb trembling on the trigger mechanism. The safety was off. If the man took 2 more steps and looked down into the dirt cavity, Mark would have to blind him and run blindly into the dark. The searcher stood there for a full minute. The silence was agonizing. Then a radio clicked on the man's shoulder. A low, gruff voice crackled through the speaker. "Nothing in the bowl. Push toward the river crossing." The man turned off his red light and continued walking toward the sound of the rushing water. The footsteps faded into the night. Mark stayed frozen in the dirt until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy. His muscles were violently cramped, and his joints were stiff from the freezing dampness. He crawled out of the hole, looking like a corpse rising from a shallow grave. He was covered in mud and leaf litter. He didn't stop to eat. He didn't even take a sip of water. He just started moving toward the sound of the river. The little river crossing in that specific sector is dangerous under normal conditions. After the recent autumn rains, it was a raging torrent of white water. But he had to cross it. The gravel logging road and his jeep were on the other side. Mark stepped into the freezing water. The current immediately slammed into his thighs, trying to sweep his legs out from under him. He used a heavy pine branch as a third point of contact, inching his way across the slick, algae-covered river rocks. The water rose to his waist, numbing his lower body instantly. Halfway across, his boot slipped on a submerged boulder. He went under. The 60-pound backpack acted like an anchor, dragging him beneath the foaming surface. He fought the current wildly, swallowing mouthfuls of icy water, thrashing his arms until his fingers scraped against a jagged rock. He hauled himself out of the main current and dragged his body onto the far bank. He collapsed in the mud, gasping for air, violently shivering. He was soaked to the bone and rapidly entering the early stages of hypothermia, but he was across. The logging road was only a mile away. He forced himself to stand. His mind was becoming sluggish from the cold, but pure, unadulterated terror kept his legs pumping. He bushwhacked through the final stretch of dense rhododendrons, his clothes tearing on the sharp branches. Finally, he broke through the tree line and saw the flat, gray surface of the gravel logging road. He could have cried. He turned south, power walking toward the rusted metal gate where he had parked his Jeep on Monday morning. As he rounded the final bend in the road, he saw the gate. His Jeep was exactly where he left it, but it wasn't alone. Parked horizontally across the narrow gravel road, completely blocking the exit, was a beat-up, dark gray Ford F-250. The truck had no license plates. Its windows were heavily tinted. There were 2 men leaning against the tailgate drinking coffee from a thermos. They were wearing standard Carhartt jackets and jeans, blending in perfectly with the local rural population. But the man on the right wasn't holding a coffee cup. He was holding a scoped hunting rifle, resting the butt of the stock casually on his hip. They were looking straight down the road, waiting for him. Mark ducked back into the tree line before they could spot him. His heart hammered in his chest. The men on the ridge hadn't just been searching the woods. They had radioed down to the road crew. The entire area was locked down. He was trapped behind enemy lines, and the gate was heavily guarded. Mark slowly backed away into the dense rhododendrons. He didn't snap a single twig. He didn't breathe. He realized with absolute certainty that his Jeep was bait. If he stepped out onto that gravel road, the man with the rifle wouldn't ask questions. They weren't there to intimidate him. They were there to make sure he never left the woods with the photos on his camera. Mark had to abandon his vehicle. It was a terrifying decision. Leaving his truck meant committing to an unknown, brutal overland hike with no food, soaking wet clothes, and creeping hypothermia. But staying meant dying. He turned his back on the logging road and began to bushwhack parallel to it, staying about 200 yards deep in the tree line. The terrain was a nightmare of deadfall and briar patches. He couldn't use the cleared path. He had to fight for every single inch of ground. He hiked like a ghost for 8 straight hours. His boots were filled with freezing river water. His hands were bleeding from tearing through thorny vines. He ignored the pain. Fear is an incredibly effective fuel. Sometime around 4 in the afternoon, the dense canopy finally broke. The ground leveled out, and the crunch of dead leaves was replaced by the low, steady hum of highway traffic. Mark had reached Route 321, a major paved highway that skirts the edge of the national park. He stumbled out of the tree line and collapsed onto the asphalt shoulder. He looked like a wild animal. He was covered in black mud, his clothes were shredded, and his lips were blue from the cold. A passing commercial delivery truck slammed on its brakes, the air horns blaring. The driver, a man in his 50s, jumped out and ran over to Mark. He didn't ask what happened. He took one look at Mark's violently shivering body, threw him into the heated cab of the truck, and locked the doors. Mark couldn't speak. His jaw was locked tight from the cold. He just pointed frantically at his chest harness where his camera was still tightly secured. The driver drove straight past the local county sheriff's dispatch. Mark managed to croak out a single sentence, begging the driver to take him to the regional FBI field office in Knoxville. He knew that if a cartel or a highly organized syndicate was operating this brazenly in the county, the local law enforcement might be compromised. He wasn't taking any chances with his life or his footage. When Mark finally sat in the sterile, brightly lit interview room at the FBI field office, he handed over his SD card. A senior tactical agent and a digital forensics tech pulled up the raw image files on a massive wall monitor. They clicked on the 3 rapid-fire photos Mark had taken of the man on the ridge. The tech zoomed in on the high-resolution image, enhancing the contrast to cut through the atmospheric haze. The details were chilling. The man wasn't a local poacher or a backwoods drug runner. The tactical chest rig he was wearing was high-end, unmarked, and loaded with specific radio equipment used by private military contractors. But the most terrifying detail wasn't the man himself. It was the background. Slightly out of focus, buried deep in the tree line behind the man, the massive telephoto lens had captured something else. It was a massive expanse of camouflage netting perfectly matched to the autumn colors of the canopy. And beneath that netting were the distinct geometric lines of industrial ventilation units and heavy generator exhaust pipes. Mark hadn't just photographed a scout. He had inadvertently captured the perimeter defense of a massive subterranean fentanyl processing laboratory built entirely off the grid deep inside the national park. The response from the federal government was swift and overwhelming. 3 days later, a joint task force of DEA agents and FBI tactical teams raided the Thunderhead Mountain ridgeline. They utilized silent, high-altitude surveillance drones and inserted via heavily armed helicopters at dawn, but the camp was completely abandoned. The syndicate had a highly effective early warning system. When their road crew reported that Mark never showed up at his Jeep, they knew the perimeter was blown. They packed up the most sensitive equipment, destroyed the rest, and vanished into the million-acre wilderness. When the FBI reached the logging gate, they found Mark's Jeep. It had been driven into a deep ravine and burned completely down to the steel frame. The heat of the fire had melted the engine block. The authorities spent weeks dismantling the remaining infrastructure under the camouflage netting. It was a multi-million-dollar operation capable of producing enough synthetic narcotics to supply the entire eastern seaboard. And it had been operating flawlessly, shielded by the sheer isolation of the Appalachian backcountry. Mark Davies never got his Jeep back. He never returned to the Great Smoky Mountains. He sold his massive telephoto lens and moved to a flat, highly populated coastal city in Florida where the tree line never gets taller than a palm tree. He refuses to hike, he refuses to camp. The FBI officially closed his case, but they placed a permanent security flag on his identity. The agents told him that syndicates with that level of funding and military-grade security do not forgive loose ends. They adapt, and they hold grudges. Mark lives in a secure apartment building with keycard access and cameras on every floor, but on quiet nights, when the wind rattles his windows, he still checks the locks. He remembers the cold, glass eye of that spotting scope staring at him across a 2-mile void. He remembers the mechanical click of the shutter. And he knows that somewhere out there, the man in the dark green jacket is still watching the tree line, waiting for someone else to wander too far off the trail. The stories. This isolated winter cabin is actually a deadly trap. The Allagash Wilderness in northern Maine is one of the most unforgiving environments in the United States. By mid-January, the temperature routinely drops to 20 below zero, and the snowdrifts can easily swallow a full-size truck. It is a place where a simple mistake, like twisting an ankle or dropping your keys in the snow, can be fatal in a matter of hours. The people who live up there respect the cold. But to outsiders, the idea of a snowed-in cabin in the deep woods sounds romantic and peaceful. In January of 2022, a 35-year-old freelance architect named Marcus Thorne was looking for exactly that kind of peace. Marcus was facing a massive deadline for a commercial design project and needed absolute silence. No emails, no phone calls, no city noise. He went online and found a listing on a secondary vacation rental site for an incredibly cheap, highly isolated A-frame cabin. The listing stated it was completely off the grid, heated by a massive cast-iron wood stove, and located 2 miles past the county plow line. You had to snowshoe in. To Marcus, it sounded like the perfect fortress of solitude. He booked it for 10 days, packed his SUV with heavy winter gear and a massive cooler of food, and drove north into the whiteout. Marcus arrived at the GPS pin on a Tuesday afternoon. The paved road simply ended at a massive wall of plowed snow. Beyond that, there was only a narrow, unbroken trail winding into the dark pine forest. He parked his truck, loaded his supplies onto a heavy plastic utility sled, strapped on his snowshoes, and began the brutal 2-mile trek. The cold was shocking. It burned his lungs with every breath. But after an hour of exhausting, sweaty work, he saw the steep black metal roof of the A-frame cutting through the trees. It looked exactly like the photos. A picturesque, rustic retreat surrounded by millions of acres of silent, frozen wilderness. He dragged his sled onto the front porch, retrieved the heavy brass key from the frozen lockbox, and pushed the front door open. The inside of the cabin was freezing, but it was clean and well-stocked with split firewood. Marcus spent the first 3 hours getting the wood stove blazing, unpacking his groceries, and setting up his laptop on the heavy oak dining table. As the cabin slowly warmed up, the sun set, plunging the woods into total darkness. Marcus felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He was completely alone, miles from another human being. But as he started to settle in for his first night, he noticed a few architectural details that didn't make sense. Architects notice things that normal people overlook. It's their job to understand how a space functions. The first thing that caught Marcus's eye was the front door. When he closed it to lock up for the night, he noticed the weight. It wasn't a standard exterior wooden door. It was a solid steel security door, the kind used in commercial warehouses, but it had been wrapped in a thin wood veneer to look rustic, and the lock was entirely backwards. It was a double-cylinder deadbolt. That means there was no thumb-turn latch on the inside. To lock or unlock the door from the inside, you had to use the actual physical key. It was a massive fire hazard. If the cabin caught fire in the middle of the night, you would have to find the key in the dark just to escape. Marcus thought it was incredibly stupid, maybe just extreme paranoia from a property owner worried about bears breaking in. He left the key sitting on the kitchen counter, locked the door, and went to bed. The wind howled against the A-frame all night, but the thick walls blocked most of the sound. He slept heavily, completely unaware of what the cabin actually was. On Wednesday morning, the weather forecast on his satellite radio called for a massive nor'easter. A blizzard was rolling in off the Canadian border, promising 3 feet of fresh snow and whiteout conditions for the next 48 hours. Marcus didn't care. He had enough chopped wood and canned chili to last 2 weeks. He spent the entire morning sitting at the oak table, drafting blueprints and listening to the wind pick up outside. Around noon, he took a break to stretch his legs. He walked over to the large picture window facing the forest to watch the snow start to fall. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass. That was when he noticed the second anomaly. The window wasn't made of standard double-pane glass. When he tapped it with his knuckle, it sounded dull and heavy. It was polycarbonate. Shatterproof plexiglass. Marcus frowned and looked closer at the window frame. There were no latches on the inside to open it for a breeze. He looked through the clear plastic to the exterior frame. Driven deep into the wood on the outside of the window were heavy, galvanized steel lag bolts. The window had been permanently sealed shut from the outside. You couldn't break it, and you couldn't open it. A cold prickle of unease washed over him. He walked to the kitchen window. Same thing, heavy plexiglass bolted from the outside. He checked the small window in the bathroom. It was identical. The cabin wasn't just weatherproofed, it was fortified. It was designed exactly like a pressure vessel. Marcus tried to rationalize it. Extreme weather requires extreme building methods, right? But the logic felt thin. He walked back to the kitchen and looked at the heavy steel front door and the double-cylinder deadbolt. He realized that if someone had the key on the outside and locked that door, the person on the inside would be trapped in a shatterproof, steel-reinforced box. There was literally no secondary exit. No back door, no sliding glass door. The cabin was a single point of entry, perfectly sealed. Marcus suddenly felt very claustrophobic. He decided he was being paranoid. He just needed to get some fresh air. He grabbed the heavy brass key off the counter, stuck it in the deadbolt, and turned it. The lock clicked open. He pushed the heavy steel door. It opened about 2 inches and then stopped with a hard metallic clunk. Marcus frowned. He pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. The door wouldn't budge. He opened it the 2 inches allowed and peered through the crack into the freezing wind. His stomach dropped into his boots. On the outside of the door, attached to the exterior frame, was a massive, heavy-duty steel padlock hasp. And hanging through the hasp was a thick, hardened steel padlock. It wasn't there when he arrived. Someone had sneaked up onto the porch while he was working, while the wind was howling, and locked him inside. The 2-inch gap was just enough play in the hasp to let the door rattle, but nowhere near enough to squeeze a hand through to reach the lock. Marcus was sealed inside the cabin. He immediately shoved his arm through the crack, trying to reach the padlock with his bare hand, but the angle was impossible. The freezing wind whipped through the small opening, chilling him instantly. He slammed the door shut and locked the deadbolt, his hands shaking violently. He wasn't alone in the woods. Someone was out there in the blizzard, and they had just locked him in a cage. Marcus ran to the large picture window and stared out into the blinding white snow. The blizzard had fully arrived. Visibility was down to less than 30 feet. He couldn't see the tree line. He couldn't see any footprints on the porch. The heavy snowfall had already erased them. He was trapped in a reinforced box miles from the nearest plowed road, with a predator waiting right outside. He grabbed his satellite radio to try and find an emergency broadcast channel, but the screen was dead. He checked the batteries. They were fresh. Then he looked at the ceiling. In the corner of the room, disguised perfectly as a small black carbon monoxide detector, was a tiny glass lens. It was a wide-angle camera, and the small red light next to it was blinking. Whoever had locked him in wasn't just leaving him to freeze. They were watching him panic. Marcus stared at the blinking red light. The panic hit him like a physical blow, but he forced it down. He was an architect. He designed buildings for a living, which meant he knew exactly how to break them apart. He grabbed the heavy cast iron fire poker sitting next to the wood stove. He walked straight over to the large picture window, gripped the iron bar with both hands, and swung it like a baseball bat right at the glass. The impact sent a violent, numbing shockwave up his arms, nearly dislocating his shoulders. The iron poker bounced right off. The plexiglass didn't even have a scratch on it. It was aerospace-grade polycarbonate, exactly the kind they use in bank teller windows to stop bullets. He swung again, aiming for the wooden frame this time. The wood splintered slightly, but the massive steel lag bolts holding the window in place on the outside didn't budge a millimeter. He was wasting his energy. He dropped the poker and started pacing the main room, breathing heavy, trying to think logically. The satellite radio wasn't just dead because of the storm, it was actively jammed. Whoever built this place had installed a localized signal blocker to cut off the outside world. He was standing inside a perfectly designed kill box. He went into the kitchen and started tearing through the drawers, looking for anything he could use as a heavy breaching tool. He found basic cooking utensils, cheap kitchen knives, and cans of soup. There were no hammers, there were no screwdrivers. The owner had completely stripped out any tool that could be used to dismantle the interior. Marcus noticed that the firewood stacked neatly by the stove was already pre-cut into small logs. There was no axe. The psychological terror of the situation really started to sink in. He walked over to the camera, disguised as a carbon monoxide detector on the ceiling. He didn't try to smash it. If he broke the camera, the person watching might decide the show was over and do something drastic. Instead, he grabbed a roll of heavy duct tape from his supplies, ripped off a piece, and slapped it directly over the lens. The red light glowed dimly through the silver tape, but he was finally out of sight. That tiny act of defiance gave him a sliver of control, but he knew it wouldn't last. The guy outside wasn't just going to let him sit there in the dark. They had a plan, and Marcus was the main event. Around 8 p.m., the cabin started to get terrifyingly cold. Marcus walked over to the cast iron wood stove to throw another log on the fading fire. He grabbed the thick metal handle of the stove door and pulled. It was stuck. He pulled harder, bracing his heavy winter boot against the base of the stove for leverage. It wouldn't open. He grabbed his flashlight and shined the beam on the hinges. Someone had driven thick metal wedges into the hinge pins from the outside, likely accessing it through the exterior chimney cleanout door. They had completely locked the firebox shut. That pre-cut wood stacked nearby was just a prop. It was a sick joke. The owner never intended for Marcus to use the stove. As the small fire inside slowly burned out and turned to ash, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. It was 10 degrees outside, and the blizzard was screaming against the walls. Without a heat source, the interior of the A-frame would hit freezing within a few hours. Marcus suddenly realized what the trap actually was. It wasn't a slasher movie scenario. It was an exposure chamber. The guy outside didn't need to come in with a weapon. He just had to wait for the main winter to do the dirty work. The cabin was a giant freezer, and Marcus was locked inside. Marcus put on every single piece of winter clothing he had brought with him. He wore 2 pairs of long johns, thick wool pants, a heavy down parka, and 2 beanies. He wrapped himself in his extreme weather sleeping bag and sat in the dead center of the room. He couldn't stop shivering. By midnight, his breath was forming thick white clouds in the dark cabin. The silence between the howling gusts of wind was deafening. He knew that if he fell asleep, he wouldn't wake up. Hypothermia is a liar. It makes you feel warm and tired right before your organs completely shut down. He had to keep moving. He had to find a structural weakness in the cabin. He forced himself to stand up. He grabbed the heavy fire poker again and began tapping it against the wooden floorboards, listening to the pitch of the wood. He moved methodically across the living room, tapping and listening. Thud, thud, thud. Then, right in front of the kitchen sink, the sound changed entirely. It went from a dull, solid thud to a sharp, hollow echo. The space underneath that specific floorboard was completely empty. He dropped to his knees and shined his flashlight on the wood. There were no nail heads. The board was friction-fitted. He wedged the tip of a kitchen knife into the seam and pried upward with all his remaining strength. The floorboard popped loose. Marcus pulled it aside, revealing a dark, narrow crawl space between the floor joists. But it wasn't just dirt underneath the cabin. He shined his light down into the hole and saw a smooth, poured concrete subfloor. Lying right there on the concrete, neatly arranged in a perfect row, were 3 driver's licenses and a collection of expensive watches. Marcus reached down with a trembling hand and pulled the IDs up. They belonged to 3 different men from 3 different states. The issue dates were all within the last 4 years. This wasn't the first time the cabin had been rented out to a solo traveler looking for a quiet retreat. The builder was collecting trophies, and Marcus was sitting directly above a graveyard. The realization sent a massive spike of pure adrenaline through his freezing body. He wasn't going to freeze to death in a box for an audience. He looked at the floor joists. They were thick, heavy timber. But architects know that a floor is only as strong as its weakest connection point. He traced the joist to where it met the exterior wall. There was a small gap where the builder had gotten lazy with the insulation. It wasn't big enough for a man to fit through, but it was a structural vulnerability, and a vulnerability could be exploited. Marcus needed a wedge. He needed something incredibly strong that could force the wooden framing apart. He looked around the freezing cabin and locked eyes on the heavy oak dining table. It was a massive piece of furniture built from solid wood. He flipped the table upside down onto the floor. Without tools, he couldn't unscrew the legs. So he started kicking. He used the heavy rubber heel of his winter boot and stomped violently on the thick wooden table leg right at the joint. After 10 agonizing minutes of kicking, the wood finally splintered, and the heavy oak leg snapped off. He had his wedge. He dragged the heavy piece of wood over to the hole in the floor. He shoved the tapered end of the table leg into the small gap between the floor joist and the exterior wall plate. Then he grabbed the cast iron fire poker. He used it like a sledgehammer, swinging it down onto the flat end of the table leg, driving the oak wedge deep into the seam. He swung with absolutely everything he had, screaming with every single strike to force the cold air out of his lungs. The cabin groaned loudly. The heavy timber began to creak and splinter under the immense concentrated pressure. Marcus was literally trying to tear the house apart from the inside out. Marcus swung the heavy iron fire poker again and again. His hands were bleeding through his thick winter gloves, the skin tearing from the massive friction and vibration of striking the solid oak. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Every time the iron hit the flat end of the table leg, the oak wedge drove a fraction of an inch deeper into the seam between the floor joist and the exterior wall. The cabin groaned like a dying animal. The heavy lag bolts holding the outer siding began to squeal under the immense pressure. Marcus was using the basic principles of leverage and structural failure to combat a reinforced cage. With one final screaming swing, he brought the poker down with everything he had left. A massive, deafening crack echoed through the freezing room. The exterior wall plate split straight down the middle. The heavy timber sheared away, taking a large section of the exterior plywood and cedar siding with it. A blast of sub-zero wind and blinding white snow instantly exploded into the crawl space, hitting Marcus right in the face. He had done it. He had breached the kill box. He didn't waste a single second. Marcus shoved his heavy winter sleeping bag through the jagged hole first, then he squeezed his shoulders into the freezing gap. The splintered wood tore through his heavy parka, scraping his ribs, but he pushed through the pain. He tumbled out of the crawl space and landed face first in a 3-foot snowdrift underneath the cabin's elevated deck. The blizzard was absolute chaos. Visibility was 0. The wind was screaming so loudly it sounded like a jet engine. Marcus grabbed his sleeping bag, wrapping it tightly around his torso, and crawled out from under the deck. As he stood up in the waist-deep snow, he looked toward the front porch. Barely visible through the whiteout, standing completely still about 20 feet away, was a man. The guy was wearing a heavy white camouflage hunting suit and a thick neoprene face mask. He was holding a high-powered hunting rifle, and he was staring directly at the heavy steel front door. He was just waiting for Marcus to eventually break down and start pounding on the metal, begging to be let out. The storm was so loud and the man was so focused on the door that he had no idea Marcus had just ripped a hole in the back of the cabin. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't try to fight. He just turned his back on the cabin and stepped into the blinding storm. He used his deep footprints from yesterday as a rough guide, letting the natural slope of the terrain steer him toward the main access road. It was the hardest physical challenge of his life. He was wading through chest-high snowdrifts, completely blind, his core temperature dropping to critical levels. The only thing keeping him alive was pure, unadulterated terror. He knew that if the man on the porch checked the camera feed or walked around the back of the cabin, the hunt would begin. Marcus hiked for 5 agonizing hours. His legs felt like lead blocks. He was hallucinating from the cold, seeing phantom lights in the trees. Just as his body completely gave out and he collapsed into the snow, a massive, vibrating rumble shook the ground beneath him. It was a county snowplow running the early morning graveyard shift to clear the main road. The driver saw a bright orange patch of Marcus's sleeping bag sticking out of a snowbank. He slammed on the brakes, dragged Marcus into the heated cab, and immediately radioed for a medical evac. When Marcus woke up in the regional hospital 2 days later, his fingers and toes were severely frostbitten, but he was alive. State troopers and a heavily armed tactical unit had already gone up the mountain to raid the A-frame, but they were too late. When they breached the heavy steel door, the cabin was completely empty. The hidden camera was gone, the heavy padlock on the front door was gone, but the hole Marcus had smashed through the floorboards was still there. The police excavated the poured concrete subfloor under the cabin. They didn't just find the IDs Marcus had seen. They found a sophisticated, soundproofed basement vault that wasn't on any county blueprint. Inside the vault were the frozen remains of 3 men. They had all been reported missing over the last 4 years after taking solo winter camping trips. The owner of the cabin had never intended to provide a peaceful vacation rental. He was running a highly organized hunting blind for humans. He used the extreme Maine winters to do the actual killing, locking his victims in a freezing, shatterproof box and simply watching them slowly freeze to death on a hidden camera. The property had been purchased through a dummy corporation using stolen identities. The police hit a dead end. They never found the man in the white camouflage. The booking website took down the listing, classifying it as a tragic fraud case. But Marcus Thorne knows the truth. He moved back to the city and refuses to travel anywhere north of the snow line. He lives in a high-rise apartment with massive, easily openable glass windows and standard wooden doors. But the psychological trauma of that cabin never left him. Every time the winter wind howls against his building, he remembers the terrifying clunk of that heavy padlock locking him inside. He remembers the thick, unbreakable plexiglass. And he knows that somewhere out there in the deep, isolated woods, the man in the white camouflage is just building a stronger box. A box with thicker walls, better cameras, and absolutely no weak points in the floor, just waiting for the next person looking for a little peace and quiet off the grid. The news stories never crossed the creek at this mountain gap. Deep inside the remote Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina, there is a totally isolated, heavily wooded valley known to locals as Miller's Gap. Running directly through the absolute lowest point of this valley is a wide, slow-moving body of water called Blackwood Creek. To any tourist or out-of-town hiker, this specific section of the creek looks like an absolute paradise. The water flows over a massive, perfectly flat slab of smooth white limestone, making the creek look like a pristine, crystal-clear wading pool. The water is literally only about 8 inches deep all the way across, and during the peak of the summer, you will constantly see off-road vehicles driving right through the water to get to the hiking trails on the other side. But the local search and rescue dive teams absolutely refuse to go anywhere near this specific crossing. Between the years of 1994 and 2012, over 11 people seemingly vanished right into thin air while trying to cross this exact ankle-deep section of the creek. For decades, the locals spread these wild rumors about flash floods washing people away or rogue animal attacks dragging hikers into the deep woods. But the physical evidence hidden inside the state police dispatch logs told a completely different story. The reality of what was actually happening at the bottom of Miller's Gap was completely grounded in natural geology, and honestly, it is so much more terrifying than any urban legend. The terrifying truth about this beautiful mountain crossing didn't officially become public record until the middle of August in 2016. It was a perfectly clear, blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon when a state forestry worker was driving his truck down the steep gravel switchbacks toward the gap. When he finally reached the bottom of the valley and pulled up to the limestone crossing, he saw a heavy-duty silver SUV parked dead in the exact center of the creek. The water was barely touching the bottom of the rubber tires. But as the worker got closer, he noticed something was incredibly wrong. All 4 doors of the heavy vehicle were left completely wide open. The engine was still quietly idling, and the radio was playing loudly through the speakers. But there was absolutely nobody inside the car, and there was nobody standing on either side of the riverbank. The forestry worker put his heavy waterproof boots on, waded out into the shallow water, and looked inside the cabin. The keys were still in the ignition. There were 2 half-eaten sandwiches sitting right on the center console, and 4 open bottles of soda that were still visibly sweating condensation in the cup holders. In the back seat, there were 2 small backpacks and a pair of children's shoes. It literally looked like a family of 4 had parked their car in the middle of the creek to cool off, stepped out into the ankle-deep water, and then simply evaporated into thin air. The worker immediately ran back to his truck and called the local sheriff's department on his emergency radio. Within 2 hours, the local sheriff had locked down the entire valley and set up a massive mobile command center right on the gravel riverbank. They brought in 30 armed deputies, an elite tracking dog unit, and a state police helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras. The detectives initially assumed the family had just wandered off into the dense woods to explore and gotten horribly lost. But as the afternoon dragged on, the physical evidence at the scene completely contradicted that theory. The tracking dogs were brought out to the edge of the water to pick up a scent, but they just paced back and forth, whined, and sat down in the mud. There were absolutely no wet footprints leading away from the creek on either side of the bank. The helicopter flew low over the massive canopy for 3 hours and didn't pick up a single heat signature for 10 miles in any direction. The detectives were totally baffled. You physically cannot drown 4 people in 8 inches of slow-moving water without leaving behind a massive, violent struggle. And if they were abducted, whoever took them would have had to drag 4 unwilling people out of a running car, through the water, and into the woods without leaving a single footprint or dropping a single piece of evidence. The lead investigator was standing on the riverbank staring at the empty, running SUV in the middle of the creek when one of the forensic technicians suddenly yelled out. He pointed to the top of the windshield on the silver SUV. Mounted directly behind the rearview mirror was a small, high-definition black plastic dash camera. It was hardwired to the car's battery, and a tiny red light on the side indicated it was still actively recording. The forensic team immediately rushed out into the water, carefully popped the small memory card out of the camera, and brought it straight to a heavy-duty laptop sitting on the hood of a police cruiser. Several detectives crowded around the glowing screen as the technician pulled up the most recent video file. The footage started exactly 1 hour before the forestry worker found the car. It showed the family driving slowly down the gravel mountain road, talking happily about setting up camp. The heavy SUV slowly rolled right into the shallow, crystal-clear water of Blackwood Creek and put the car in park. The audio captured the father telling the kids they could step out for just a minute to cool their feet off. The front-facing camera showed the mother and the 2 children walking around the front bumper of the car, laughing and splashing in the incredibly shallow, perfectly calm water. Then, the father walked out in front of the lens to join them. But suddenly, the father accidentally dropped his expensive sunglasses into the water. The camera recorded him bending over to fish them out of the ankle-deep creek. But when his hand touched the limestone riverbed, something absolutely defying all logic happened. The father didn't stand back up. Instead, his entire arm, followed immediately by his shoulder and his head, was violently sucked straight down into the solid white rock. Within 2 seconds, his entire body disappeared completely under the 8-inch surface of the water, leaving absolutely no splash and no ripples. The camera captured the mother screaming in absolute terror and diving into the shallow water to grab him. But the exact second her knees hit the limestone floor, she was also violently yanked straight down into the rock and vanished. The two children ran over to help their parents, and one by one, the footage showed them being pulled completely underwater into a creek that was barely deep enough to cover a pair of boots. The group of detectives staring at that laptop screen on the hood of the police cruiser were absolutely speechless. The lead investigator actually had the forensic technician rewind the dashcam footage 4 separate times because his brain literally could not process what he was looking at. It looked like a terrible special effect in a movie. You physically cannot fall through solid rock, but the video clearly showed 4 human beings being violently sucked straight down into a riverbed that was completely visible and only 8 inches deep. Realizing this was no longer a standard missing persons case, the sheriff immediately got on his radio and called in the state's elite subterranean dive and rescue team. Within 3 hours, a massive convoy of heavy-duty utility trucks rolled into the valley. The dive team didn't treat this like a normal drowning. They geared up in heavy, reinforced dry suits, bolted heavy lead weights to their belts, and anchored thick steel tether lines directly to the heavy metal bumpers of their trucks. The lead diver slowly waded out into the shallow, crystal-clear water, walking exactly in the tire tracks of the silver SUV. When he got to the exact spot right in front of the vehicle's bumper, he didn't step forward. Instead, he took a heavy, solid steel probing rod and gently tapped the white limestone floor. It hit solid rock. He moved it 2 inches to the right and tapped again. Solid rock. But when he moved the heavy steel rod just 6 inches forward to the exact spot where the father had reached for his sunglasses, the heavy iron pole was instantly and violently ripped straight out of his thick neoprene gloves. It shot straight down through the crystal clear water and completely vanished. There was absolutely no splash. The surface of the creek remained perfectly flat and perfectly calm. As it turned out, the terrifying reality of Miller's Gap was a perfect, deadly geological trap. The State Geological Survey team brought in heavy sonar equipment and mapped the ground directly beneath the creek, and what they found was absolutely horrifying. That beautiful, perfectly flat slab of white limestone that everyone loved to drive and walk across was essentially just a fragile, razor-thin roof. Directly beneath Blackwood Creek was a massive, violently rushing underground river system that had been carving out a huge subterranean cavern for millions of years. At that specific spot right in front of the SUV, the limestone roof had finally worn completely through, creating a jagged, vertical fissure about 3 feet wide. But the real terror was the optical illusion. Because the crystal clear water of the creek was rushing completely flat and smooth over the top of this hole, the natural refraction of the sunlight made the massive gap completely invisible from above. It looked exactly like the rest of the solid, safe rock bottom, but mechanically it was a death trap. The water rushing over that hidden gap was pouring straight down into the pitch-black cave system below, creating a massive, inescapable hydraulic siphon. It was literally pulling thousands of gallons of water straight down into the earth every single minute. It was basically a giant invisible vacuum hidden perfectly beneath 8 inches of totally calm, inviting water. The dive team had to secure heavy-duty motorized winches to the trees just to lower themselves into the vortex without being instantly crushed by the sheer water pressure. When they finally breached the subterranean cavern, their heavy flashlights illuminated a massive pitch-black echo chamber filled with violently churning, freezing water. The physical reality of what happened to the family was absolutely devastating. The forensic engineers calculated that the hydraulic pressure of the invisible siphon was pulling with over 800 pounds of downward force. When the father accidentally dropped his sunglasses and reached into the water to grab them, his hand broke the visual plane of the hole. The second his fingers entered the current, the vacuum instantly grabbed his arm and violently ripped his entire body down into the dark. It was so fast and so powerful that a human being literally couldn't fight it. When the mother and the children desperately reached into the water to pull him out, they were instantly grabbed by the exact same mechanical force and flushed straight down into the flooded, pitch-black underground cave system. There were absolutely no pockets of breathable air down there. They didn't stand a chance. Following the horrific recovery operation, the state forestry department didn't even bother putting up warning signs. They literally brought in a demolition crew, packed the white limestone shelf with heavy explosives, and completely blasted the entire crossing into massive, jagged boulders so that absolutely no one could ever walk on it again. Today, the silver SUV remains sitting in a police impound lot, and county road officials built a massive steel bridge right over the ruins of the creek. The stories. What the senior ranger found inside the locked fire tower. People think being a forest ranger is just about giving directions to tourists and rescuing lost hikers. But the reality of managing millions of acres of deep American wilderness is a lot darker. When you get far enough off the grid, the rules of society simply stop existing. The deep woods become a hiding place for people who never want to be found, and for operations that require absolute secrecy. In the vast, rugged expanse of the Bitterroot National Forest in Idaho, there are dozens of abandoned fire lookout towers. These were built back in the 1930s. They are essentially 14 by 14 foot glass boxes sitting on top of steel legs, sometimes 100 feet in the air. By the late 1990s, most of these towers were decommissioned. To keep reckless teenagers from climbing them and falling to their deaths, the Forestry Service used a standard protocol. They would remove the bottom 2 flights of stairs and use an acetylene torch to permanently weld the heavy steel trapdoor shut at the top. They were supposed to be sealed forever. But in late October of 2021, a 55-year-old senior ranger named Art Rollins discovered that one of these towers wasn't empty at all. Art was doing a routine boundary patrol near the Montana border. It was late in the season. The tourist crowds were gone, the temperature was hovering right around freezing, and the first major snowstorm of the year was due to hit in 48 hours. Art was driving his beat-up forestry truck down an old, unmaintained logging road that hadn't been actively used in a decade. He was heading toward a specific peak to check the structural integrity of the Black Ridge Fire Tower. It was a 90-foot steel tower sitting on a highly exposed granite cliff. Nobody had been up there in over 20 years. But as Art parked his truck and started the mile-long hike up the steep ridge, he noticed something on the ground. Winding through the dead pine needles and frost were fresh tire tracks. They weren't from a forestry truck, they were from a heavy-duty four-wheel drive ATV. And they were heading straight up the mountain right toward the base of the abandoned tower. Art unclipped the safety strap on his holster. Finding ATV tracks in a closed sector isn't an emergency, but it puts a ranger on high alert. Poachers often use ATVs to haul out illegally killed elk. He followed the tracks up the steep incline, keeping his head on a swivel. When he broke through the tree line and stepped out onto the rocky clearing beneath the tower, the ATV was gone. But something else was there. Hidden carefully in the brush, right next to the massive steel legs of the tower, was a specialized telescoping tactical ladder. It was painted matte black. It was fully extended and hooked perfectly onto the lowest remaining set of stairs, completely bypassing the safety gap the Forestry Service had created. Whoever put it there wasn't just exploring. They had brought highly specific, expensive equipment to access the tower. Art pulled his radio to call dispatch, but all he got was dead static. The granite mountains in this sector completely blocked the repeater signals. He was totally on his own. He had a choice. He could hike back down to his truck and drive an hour to get a signal, or he could climb up and see exactly what was going on. Art was old school. He chose to climb. Climbing a 90-foot steel tower in freezing winds is terrifying. The old metal stairs groaned and vibrated under his boots. The wind was whipping at 30 miles per hour, trying to tear him off the railing. It took him 10 agonizing minutes to reach the narrow wooden catwalk that wrapped around the glass cabin at the very top. He was completely exposed, 100 feet in the sky. He kept his back pressed against the glass and slowly shimmied his way around to the trap door built into the floor of the catwalk. This was the door that was supposed to be welded shut. But as Art looked down at the heavy steel plate, his stomach completely dropped. The thick, ugly weld marks from 20 years ago were gone. Someone had hauled a portable plasma cutter all the way up this tower and sliced through these solid steel hinges with surgical precision. But that wasn't the craziest part. The crazy part was the lock. The trapdoor wasn't padlocked on the outside. Someone had installed a massive, heavy-duty sliding deadbolt on the inside of the hatch. Whoever was using this tower locked themselves in from the inside. Art knelt on the catwalk. He placed his hands flat on the steel trapdoor and pushed upward. It was heavy, but the deadbolt wasn't engaged. The door swung up smoothly on brand-new oiled hinges. He poked his head up through the floor hole and into the glass cabin. It was supposed to be an empty, dusty room with shattered windows and bird nests. Instead, it looked like a military command center. The 14 by 14 space was completely weather-sealed. Thick, custom-cut blackout curtains were rolled up above every single window. On the floor sat a massive bank of deep-cycle marine batteries, wired directly to 3 high-efficiency solar panels mounted to the roof. But it was the equipment sitting on the old wooden map table that made Art realize he had stumbled into something incredibly dangerous. There were no sleeping bags or camping stoves. There were high-end, encrypted aviation radios. There were 2 night vision spotting scopes mounted on heavy tripods, pointing out different windows. And right in the center of the table was a portable, military-grade radar tracking unit. The screen was dark, but it was plugged in and humming quietly. Art stepped fully into the cabin and let the trapdoor close softly behind him. He walked over to the table. Beside the radar unit was a heavy, waterproof ledger. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, times, and GPS coordinates. As he scanned the data, the terrifying reality of the situation clicked into place. These weren't poachers. They weren't squatters. This was a spotter's nest for an international cartel. The Bitterroot National Forest sits right below the Canadian border. The vast, unpopulated airspace is a massive blind spot for conventional law enforcement. The cartel was flying small, unregistered Cessna airplanes low over the mountains, flying totally dark without transponders. The guys in this tower were using the portable radar and the encrypted radios to guide those planes through the treacherous mountain passes at night. They were triangulating massive airdrops of synthetic narcotics, communicating the drop zones to ground crews hiding down in the valleys. This single glass box was the air traffic control center for a multi-million-dollar smuggling pipeline. Art knew he was standing in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. He needed to get out of the tower immediately, hike down to his truck, and drive straight to the FBI field office in Boise. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket to take a quick video of the ledger and the radar equipment. He framed the shot and hit record. But right as the recording started, a sound cut through the howling wind outside. It was a low, mechanical growl echoing off the granite cliffs below. It was an engine. Art froze. He walked slowly over to the glass window facing the access trail and looked straight down the 90-foot drop. Breaking through the tree line directly beneath him were 2 men on a heavy-duty ATV. They weren't wearing forestry uniforms. They were wearing dark tactical gear, and both of them had assault rifles strapped across their chests. They drove right up to the base of the tower and cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Art was 100 feet in the air, locked inside a glass box, and the men who owned the equipment were already climbing the ladder. Art stared through the narrow gaps in the floorboards at the 2 men beginning their ascent. The metallic clank of their heavy tactical boots hitting the lower steel rungs echoed up the skeletal structure like a slow, deliberate countdown. He was trapped in a 14 by 14 foot glass box with zero cover. There was absolutely nowhere to hide inside the cabin. He couldn't lock the heavy sliding deadbolt on the trapdoor to buy himself time. If he locked it, the cartel spotters would instantly know someone was inside their secure command center. They wouldn't bother trying to pry the heavy steel plate open. They would simply step back onto the lower landing, raise their assault rifles, and empty their magazines straight up through the thin wooden floorboards, shredding the entire cabin and everyone inside it. He had less than 2 minutes before they reached the top catwalk. Art frantically scanned the ceiling. Built into the slanted metal roof was a small 2-by-2-foot maintenance hatch, originally designed so rangers could clear heavy snow accumulation during extreme winters. It was secured by a simple rusted iron latch. Art quietly dragged a heavy wooden chair to the center of the room, wincing at every microscopic scrape the wood made against the floor. He climbed up, unhooked the latch, and pushed the heavy metal panel upward. The freezing mountain wind instantly ripped the hatch open, nearly tearing it off its rusted hinges. Art grabbed the edges of the frozen metal framing and hauled his upper body through the tiny hole. He kicked the chair away, pulled his legs up, and squeezed onto the exterior roof. He gently lowered the hatch back into place, leaving it completely unlatched just as the first set of heavy boots hit the wooden catwalk directly below him. The roof of a backcountry fire tower is not designed for human habitation or stealth. It is a steeply pitched pyramid of corrugated tin, coated in decades of slick, freezing moss and accumulated ice. Art laid completely flat on his stomach, splaying his arms and legs out like a starfish to maximize his surface area and prevent himself from sliding backward off the terrifying edge. He was 100 feet in the air, with absolutely no safety railing, facing a 90-foot drop to the jagged granite boulders at the base of the cliff. The wind was screaming at gale force, dropping the ambient wind chill to 10 below zero. Through the thin metal roof beneath his chest, he heard the heavy steel trapdoor swing open. The two men climbed into the cabin. Art stopped breathing. He pressed his face against the freezing tin, listening intently to the muffled thud of their boots on the wooden floor. They didn't speak immediately. They were moving around the cramped room, dropping heavy canvas duffel bags, unzipping equipment cases, and checking their battery banks. Then, the ambient noise in the cabin stopped completely. The silence was sudden and terrifying. Art knew exactly what had happened. He had left the waterproof ledger lying wide open on the map table. The men realized instantly that their highly classified, multi-million-dollar logistics log had been disturbed by an outsider. The quiet didn't last long. One of the men started shouting rapidly in Spanish, and the heavy metal door leading out to the exterior catwalk slammed violently open. Art pressed himself as flat as physically possible, digging his fingernails into the shallow grooves of the corrugated tin. The two heavily armed men stepped out onto the narrow wooden walkway wrapping around the glass cabin. They were less than 3 feet directly below him. He could hear the heavy nylon fabric of their tactical vests scraping against the glass windows as they moved. One of the men racked the charging handle of his rifle, chambering a live round. The sharp mechanical clack was unmistakable and cut right through the sound of the wind. They started sweeping the surrounding tree line and the steep drop-offs with high-powered tactical flashlights, looking desperately for whoever had been inside their nest. The intense beams of light cut through the freezing fog, sweeping over the distant pine trees and the steep access road below. Then, one of the men aimed his flashlight straight up at the structure itself. The blinding white beam hit the edge of the tin roof, literally inches from Art's left boot. The glare was blinding. If the man took one single step backward on the narrow catwalk and tilted his head a fraction of an inch higher, he would clearly see Art's legs clinging to the overhang. Art squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for the deafening crack of a rifle firing directly up through the thin metal overhang, but the man didn't step back. The bitter, freezing wind of the approaching snowstorm was lashing at their exposed faces, making it impossible to keep their eyes open to the sky. Believing the intruder had already fled back down the mountain to call for backup, the men cursed loudly, turned off their flashlights, and stepped back inside the cabin. They slammed the heavy door and locked the deadbolt from the inside, sealing themselves in. The immediate threat of discovery had passed, but Art's situation had just escalated from highly dangerous to completely lethal. The first bands of the massive winter snowstorm finally hit the Bitterroot Mountains with full force. Thick, blinding snow began to fall, instantly turning the steep, pitched tin roof into a frictionless sheet of ice. Art was trapped on the outside of the glass box, fully exposed to a massive blizzard with zero heavy winter survival gear. He couldn't go back inside through the maintenance hatch. The men were sitting directly beneath it, their assault rifles ready, actively monitoring their radar screens for incoming flights. If he stayed on the roof, he would succumb to extreme hypothermia and freeze to death, or simply be blown off the edge by the escalating winds within the hour. He had to get down to the ground. But the only ladder was guarded by the men inside the cabin. He looked over the terrifying edge of the roof at the massive skeletal steel framework that supported the tower. The four main corner legs were connected by heavy, diagonal cross-bracing steel beams. It wasn't a ladder. It was a sheer, structural lattice dropping 90 feet straight down into the black abyss. It was an incredibly reckless, suicidal climbing route. But freezing on the roof was a mathematical guarantee. Art slowly slid backward toward the edge of the roof, his frozen fingers desperately gripping the corrugated ridges. He swung his legs over the terrifying drop and felt blindly in the dark for the top of the steel corner post. His heavy work boot finally made contact with the icy metal. Art transferred his entire body weight off the roof and onto the exterior framework of the tower. He was completely suspended in the howling blizzard, his fingers wrapping around freezing steel I-beams that were slick with fresh ice. He began the slowest, most agonizing descent of his entire life. He couldn't see the ground. He could only see the next 3 feet of steel directly in front of his face. He moved mere inches at a time, violently testing every handhold and foothold before shifting his weight. The wind battered his body continuously, trying to peel him off the structure like a flag. Halfway down, the storm became a complete whiteout. His hands went entirely numb. He wasn't gripping the steel with muscle anymore. He was gripping it with raw mechanical force, locking his joints in place and relying purely on the friction of his heavy canvas sleeves. He climbed directly past the large glass windows of the cabin, praying that the heavy blackout curtains the cartel had installed would prevent them from seeing his massive shadow moving outside the glass. At one point, his right boot slipped off a frozen rivet, leaving him dangling by his numb arms over a 60-foot drop. He managed to hook his knee over a cross brace and haul himself back onto the framework, his heart hammering so hard he felt it in his teeth. The descent took nearly 2 agonizing hours. When his boots finally hit the solid, snow-covered granite of the mountain floor, his legs immediately buckled. He collapsed into the snow, his entire body shaking uncontrollably from the extreme physical exertion, the freezing cold, and the massive adrenaline dump. Art didn't allow himself to rest. He crawled on his hands and knees over to the heavy-duty ATV the men had parked under the dense canopy of the pine trees. He pulled his heavy, folding tactical knife from his belt and violently slashed all 4 of the thick, all-terrain tires, puncturing the thick rubber until they were entirely flat. He crawled under the chassis and completely severed the main fuel line, letting the gasoline pour out into the snow. He was guaranteeing the men would be stranded on the top of the mountain once their shift was over. Then he turned and ran. He bushwhacked through the blinding blizzard for 3 solid miles, totally ignoring the established trails, terrified they would send a heavily armed ground crew up the logging road to investigate the broken lock. When he finally reached his forestry truck, he cranked the heater to maximum and drove like a madman, fishtailing down the icy mountain roads until his radio finally caught a signal. He bypassed his local forestry dispatch entirely and called the FBI field office directly. Within 12 hours, the quiet, abandoned mountain road was swarming with federal agents, armored Bearcat vehicles, and DEA tactical teams. Because of the extreme blizzard conditions, the cartel spotters couldn't get a helicopter to extract them, and their primary ground transport was destroyed. They were perfectly trapped inside their own glass command center. When the FBI tactical team breached the heavy steel trapdoor at dawn, the men surrendered without firing a single shot. The intelligence recovered from that single waterproof ledger was unprecedented. It systematically dismantled a massive multi-state synthetic drug pipeline that had been operating with total impunity in the National Forest airspace for over 5 years. The radar logs provided exact coordinates for dozens of hidden drop zones across the Pacific Northwest, leading to hundreds of arrests. Ranger Art Rollins received a massive commendation from the Department of Justice for his bravery and quick thinking, but the psychological toll was permanent. He never climbed another fire lookout tower for the rest of his career. He explicitly requested a transfer to a low-elevation sector, preferring to spend his final years patrolling flat, open ground. He knows exactly how vulnerable you are when you're trapped in a tiny glass box 100 feet above the earth, separated from a sheer drop by a thin sheet of metal, suddenly realizing you aren't the only one hiding in the deep woods.